Let's talk about the anatomy of both the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus. Now, as for the pituitary gland is found at the inferior region of the hypothalamus. In fact, it is attached to the median side of the hypothalamus via stalk, resulting in a pouching of the gland. And that pouch in itself has two lobes, both the anterior lobe, which is found at the anterior side, and a posterior lobe, which is found posteriorly. Now, as for the anatomy, this is the hypothalamus. Now, this hypothalamus is an area of the brain which is part of the limbic system and is found at the floor of the brain. Now, this hypothalamus has a specific outpouching known as the median eminence. This is the median eminence and this is the hypothalamus. Next, we have the pituitary gland. This here is the pituitary gland with its anterior lobe and the posterior lobe. Sometimes the anterior lobe and the posterior lobes are separately named as the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. The reason being the anterior pituitary synthesizes its own hormones, while the posterior pituitary lobe does not synthesizes its own hormones. The hormones are synthesized in the hypothalamus, transported to the posterior lobe. So, because of this crucial difference, sometimes the lobes are differentiated and are called separately. Next, we have an area known as the pars intermedia. Now, pars intermedia is the area between the both lobes. Now, these area sometimes is termed as a lobe in itself, known as the intermediate lobe. And research has shown that in some animals, in humans, it releases a certain hormone known as the melanotropic hormone, which increases the synthesis of melanin. In humans, it is a very reduced area, which is sometimes even ignored in certain texts. But in lower animals, the pituitary gland has three lobes: the anterior, posterior, and the median lobe, signifying that it is through evolution, it has become vestigial. It has reduced both in function and anatomy, but it has certain function, and research is still going on as to what function that is. Now, we do know that what kind of peptide it releases, but what is the function of that said peptide, it's still under trials. Next, we have the hypophyseal stalk. Now, the hypophyseal stalk, also known as the infundibulum, is the stalk which connects the both lobes of the pituitary gland to the hypothalamus. Now, this stalk is of utmost importance. Why? Because first of all, it contains the tuberal part of the anterior lobe and the area through which the transport of the posterior pituitary lobe hormones take place. They are synthesized in the hypothalamus, transported through the stalk, usually in the axons, through the exoplasm, and into the posterior lobe. So, any problem with the stalk will result in the total disruption of the function of the pituitary gland. Next, we have the mammary body. Now, mammary body here is only shown to give you an idea that how near the pituitary gland is to the hypothalamus. It is not as far as the diagram signifies. It is quite near, to the point that it almost sticks together with the median eminence of the hypothalamus. This is the optic chiasm, the area where the both optic nerves cross each other. Now, this was the anatomy of the pituitary gland. Now, you have to remember the anatomy of the pituitary gland in order to understand its function. And when you understand the function, you will understand the physiology of the pituitary gland. Now, let's take all of those anatomical structures in a much more detail. Now, like I said, pituitary gland is found at the floor of the brain, found inferiorly to the hypothalamus. Now, this is the pituitary gland with its stalk, the infundibulum. This is the hypothalamus, and this is the cavity of the third ventricle. So you can easily appreciate that how these all these structures are almost compressed together. So any kind of outgrowth here will put pressure on one of the structures, resulting in the function or the disruption of that structure. So this is the anterior pituitary, this is the posterior pituitary, this is the sphenoid bone, and this is the depression in this sphenoid bone known as the sella turcica. Now this is important because this pouch, the anterior and the posterior pituitary gland, because they rest inside a depression in the bone, they are covered from all sides, from trauma, from any kind of malignant or benign growth, all from but one side, that is the superior area. So this again is the optic chiasm, where the both of the optic nerves cross each other. This is the anterior pituitary tuberal lobe. Now this is an area where the anterior pituitary gland moves superiorly along the infundibulum towards the hypothalamus. Now, this has no physiological meaning to it because it does not contain enough vascularity and enough cells to contribute towards the anterior pituitary. So, because of this reason, it only produces the growth hormone and the follicle stimulating hormone and the luteinizing hormone. So, this tuberal lobe has no physiological meaning, only anatomical significance, because any damage to this area might result in lower level of these hormones. Now this is the diaphragma sella. Now diaphragma sella is the reflection or the pouching of the dura mater which covers the pituitary gland. Now it covers the pituitary gland because one, it reflects around it, second, it protects it. So this is the dura mater, one of the toughest members of the meninges, and when this dura mater comes in contact with this depression inside the sphenoid bone, it forms a kind of a pouch, and inside the pouch resides the pituitary gland. So you can easily appreciate at this point that pituitary gland is protected both anatomically by the bone from all sides except superiorly, and it is also protected physiologically by the dura mater by forming a pouch around it. Now, all of these protection is necessary for the proper functioning of this gland, because any disruption in this gland will cause total disruption in an adult and disruption in the growth of a child. Next is the sella turcica. Now this again is the depression in the sphenoid bone that I was talking about. Next is the pituitary fossa. Now pituitary fossa is name given to the depression that is found inside the sphenoid bone where the pituitary gland resides. Next we have the fibrocollagenous septum that contains cysts. Now this septum between the both of the lobes of the pituitary gland is necessary that it contains both fibro and collagenous septum, because like I said, anterior lobe has a different method of manufacturing hormones while the posterior lobe has a different method of manufacturing and releasing hormones. So the tissue of both of these lobes must not get across much. There must not be any infiltration from the anterior lobe to the posterior and vice versa. And this doesn't happen only because of the septum that is found between the anterior and the posterior lobe. And this septum, because it is both fibrous and collagenous, is very hard, and usually any kind of infiltration of tissue of either lobes does not happen. Now the cysts at this area are usually found only to reinforce the septum. Next, we have the anterior pituitary with its intermediate lobe. Now, like I said, the septum is the area which divides both the anterior and the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. But I also mentioned that there is a median lobe found between both. Now, if we talk in anatomical terms, that median lobe is actually a part of the anterior pituitary. Why? Because it lies anteriorly to the septum. So sometimes it is also known as the anterior pituitary intermediate lobe. So anterior pituitary can have both the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe. Next, we have the neural lobe or the posterior lobe. Now, why it's called neural lobe? Like I said, both of the hormones which are released by the posterior gland are formed in the hypothalamus but then released by the posterior lobe. So, because they are produced in the neuronal tissue, sometimes the posterior lobe or the posterior pituitary gland is also termed as the neuronal lobe. To the point, you will even find the term neurohypophysis in relation to the posterior lobe, and the word adenohypophysis in relation to the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. Now this is the pituitary stalk. Now this pituitary stalk, also known as the infundibulum, contains both of the this tuberal lobe of the anterior pituitary and the axons uh, which make up the extensions of both the nuclei which form both the ADH and the oxytocin hormones. So any disruption in the vascularity of infundibulum can have effects on both the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe. Now we will discuss the vascularity of both the infundibulum, anterior lobe and the posterior lobe, and how they are connected, how they are different, and why those differences occur. But as for this anatomical slide, we will not discuss it because it will further complicate already given information. Now, this again is the median eminence. Now this median eminence is of hypothalamus. So the part of the hypothalamus which connects to the pituitary gland through the infundulum is known as the median eminence. This is the memory body, again to give you an idea where the pituitary gland lies in relation to the hypothalamus.